Good morning, everybody, and obviously I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to the New School, and in particular to the New School for Social Research. My name is Mark Setterfield, and I'm currently Chair and Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research. And it's my pleasure to begin the proceedings today by making a few opening remarks ahead of the presentation and discussion of this year's United Nations Trade and Development Report. I think it's fair to say that in many ways, the UN and the NSSR share common origin. Both organizations arose from the ferment of the early 20th century, and in particular from the series of catastrophic events at that time that marked the final demise of a failed 19th century system of international relations. Since then, both the UN and the NSSR have in different ways expressed commitment to an international order based on rule of law. And I'm sure that, sadly, I don't have to remind any of you that that vision of international order based on rule of law is now increasingly under threat, if not attack, from a variety of different quarters, advised variously by nationalism, nativism, and even explicit xenophobia and racism in cases. All of those, of course, are ugly reminders of precisely the sort of conditions that both the NSSR and the UN originally sought to transcend. I think that the links between the two organizations are especially strong when it comes to economic philosophy. Thinking here of economic philosophy as embedded in the economics department, of course, here at the New School for Social Research, and also in key UN agencies, including CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. This economic philosophy, I think, can be nicely summarized by 2 points. The first is a vision of and commitment to shared prosperity based on inclusive and sustainable growth. And the second point is a sense that that purpose can be meaningfully and positively served by both public and international organizations. Of course, this brings us then directly and in no uncertain terms to the 2019 Trade and Development, and its focus on the aims and objectives of the policy and institutional prerequisites for, and in particular, the financing of global Green New Deal. So our program of events today will begin with a presentation of trade and development itself by Jeronim Capaldo. Jere is an economist at UNCTAD. He's also a research fellow at Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute, and he's actually a co-author of the Trade and Development Report itself. I can't also just mentioning that he is a New School alum. In fact, I was on his dissertation committee, so I'll be paying particular attention to every presentation. Never ends. Right. Following Jere's presentation, we'll hear a discussion of the report from 4 distinguished panelists: María, Fernanda, Espinosa, Garces, Rogério, Studart, Joshua Mason, and Adnan. María Fernanda Espinosa Garces is the president of the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly. Served Ecuador as Minister of Foreign Affairs on 2 occasions, Minister of National Defense, Coordinating Minister of Natural Resources, and previously held an associate professor researcher at Latin American faculty. María has published widely with a particular focus on the Amazon, topics ranging from sustainable development, climate change, and Rogério Studart is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute and an associate professor of economics at Federal University of Rio. As executive director and alternate director of the World Bank from 2017 and the Inter-American Development Bank from 2003-2007. Rogério's work focuses on global economics, emerging markets, development finance, and national institutions. And again, I can't resist mentioning that Rogério and I have a long history. We first met just after we'd defended our PhD dissertations at the famous, in some circles, Malvern Political Economy Conference. We have a habit of surprising each other by turning up at events like this over the past 25 years or so. So nice to see you again, Rogério, but we do have to stop meeting like this. Well, okay, that would be even better. Yeah. Joshua Mason is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, where he works on the Financialization Project, and an assistant professor of economics at John Jay College, was part of UNCTAD. His current research focuses on the political economy of credit, including the evolution of household debt and the changing role of financial markets in business investment. And last but not least, Adnan Amin is a senior fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy. First Director General of International Renewable Energy. Prior to it, he worked in senior positions within the UN in areas of renewable energy, sustainable development, and environmental policy. So after we first heard from Jere and then our four panelists, there'll be an opportunity for questions. Events as a whole will moderate. Damien is a senior editor of Nation and the author of the 20 non-fight coming over. So, without further ado, I'll ask those that are fund by Jere.
I'm sorry for those that don't see me, I have to stand here for the microphone. 2 years ago, in international policy circles and around this time of the year, there was plenty of talk of a brave new world, of a recovery underway, of a safer financial system, and in the developing world and around the development discussion of catching up again, convergence, and other promising trends. No more. This year, all that talk has gone almost completely silent. International organizations are downgrading their forecasts, their longer-term projections, and most importantly, policymakers are now anxiously discussing the vulnerabilities that have accumulated in most economies in the world. There is also a clear tendency to look out for the next shock, who's going to precipitate the next crisis. And you can be pretty sure that this will be the main, or one of the main points of discussion at the next meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Now, what we see as characterizing the global economy right now is a story that is conspicuous by its absence, and that's a solid global recovery. We see very weak growth that has failed to gain momentum despite 10 years have passed since the global financial crisis. We see advanced economies that have been relying increasingly on asset markets to generate some modicum of growth, and that have been cutting wages, that have been compressing public spending almost incessantly. And we see developing countries that are relying, again, on commodity markets to gain revenues, and on dangerous debt dangerous debt products, and that are accumulating debt. And we see some several important countries slowing down dangerously, if not already in recession. In the background, we see a marked slowdown of trade growth. So international trade is still growing, but at a much slower pace than it was before. And we see financialization keeping up its path across the world economy. And we see countries, especially in the developing world, having to accumulate buffers to protect themselves from any sudden reversals in the flows of capital that cross their borders. We also see a general problem that is promising to keep the situation as it is, which is a very disappointing trend for productive investment. We see in the past 10 years, we've seen, actually in the past 20 years, we've seen a strong increase in credit supply all across the board in the form of multiple products and in all countries. But real investment has not kept pace with this credit growth. So in other words, all this money has not gone to infrastructure, to productive capacity, and to strengthening the real economy in either developed or developing countries. Therefore, it has gone into speculative activities. And therefore, the credit growth that was supposed to fuel the recovery and was supposed to strengthen the development process, chances are it has gone into weakening it quite substantially by fueling markets, unstable financial markets that are producing the risk of sudden movements and sudden storms in the financial universe. This is a special problem for developing countries that are facing this resource transfer, whereby they need to insure themselves against the risk of capital flights. In order to do that, they need to accumulate reserves in foreign currencies, mostly in dollars and in dollar-denominated assets, which they gain a revenue from. But because these assets are relatively safe assets, the revenues are very low. Meanwhile, in order to keep the capitals within their borders or prevent them from leaving, they need to service higher, more costly debt or pay higher revenues to make sure that this capital is encouraged to stay. The net difference is a resource transfer that goes from developing to developed countries that is quite substantial. By our calculation, is in the order of $440 billion a year. So this should figure prominently in the discussion on financing for development, but I'll say something to that in a second. We also have in this realm the problem of phantom FDI, which now everybody recognizes. The IMF research department is about to publish a paper with numbers on this phenomenon. It talks about $600 billion of phantom FDIs, that is flows or stocks that are registered as investment, but in countries like Luxembourg, for example, which apparently has the same amount of inward foreign direct investment as the United States. Clearly, this does not go into productive investment, and it creates an obvious source of concern. We also notice that the Bretton Woods institution that ensured for several decades financial stability in the world, upholding a mandate that was given to them in the conference right after the Second World War, are not really serving that purpose anymore, because their effectiveness and their job has been derailed over the years, and they've now become more often the guardians of free capital movements rather than financial stability. Meanwhile, the labor share, that's the cut that labor gets out of total income, has been decreasing across the board. These are particularly scary graphs that tell us what's happened in developed and developing countries, and that underlying the tension and the pressure on labor income everywhere in the world. Debt meantime, has been accumulating. And it's not just public debt that's been accumulating in a lot of countries, including developing countries, but it is also, unfortunately, private debt. And that's a story that's less discussed. Private debt is the green area on these figures. So the growth of private debts is staggering. We talk about it in the financial press sometimes, these leveraged debt products that are basically loans to companies that no one wants to lend to because they are in trouble already. And we know that this is a big market in the $1 trillion order probably, and we know that that's a potential source of financial chaos. Now, these are problems that have been accumulating now for quite some time, and another problem has also been rising also for quite some time, a longer time even, and that's the environmental crisis. So, out of all the ways in which we can measure it, one way to represent it is to look at the accumulation of carbon emissions. This is a particularly striking chart that shows how it's been skyrocketing since in the recent decades. Now, the issue then in the global economy is that we're facing combined challenges. We're facing a challenge of insufficient incomes, especially labor incomes, a recovery that is not happening, financial fragility. We're facing a challenge of development that is proceeding too slow if it's not, in fact, progressing in reverse in the form of deindustrialization. And we're facing a climate challenge. We're also facing an international policy discussion that has privileged a neoliberal strategy by which eliminating controls on capital flows and liberalizing markets and ensuring that labor incomes lead to lower and lower costs and facilitating international trade is supposed to produce this recovery and the strengthening of economic momentum everywhere in the world. But this has not happened. We know that this has not happened since the global financial crisis. We know that this has not happened since the agenda has been pursued with particular strength as of the mid-70s or early 80s. And unfortunately, the discussion on development and on the SDGs often reflects this single-minded focus. And it tends to talk about the problem of financing the SDGs to solve all these challenges in terms of finding the financial resources, as if finding the financial resources automatically meant making the necessary investments to engender the transformation, the green transformation, and generating full employment in developed countries, and rebalancing labor incomes. But we know that that's not the case. The chart I've shown a moment ago says that just by throwing money into the financial system, investment doesn't necessarily happen. In fact, investment needs to be guided for it to happen. And private investors will do their job as investors if the economy recovers and if there is a lead to follow that will ensure that new possibilities for investment are viable. And this suggests that a strategy, a different strategy, a strategy which focuses on a public lead, a state-led investment program that addresses the necessary investment head-on, that rebalances income distribution with appropriate regulation that strengthens labor's bargaining power, that regulates financial flows to make sure that countries can regain the policy space they need to, especially in developing countries, but everywhere, to protect their economies and also follow through with their public spending program when necessary. Well, that's a policy package that we refer to as the Global Green New Deal. Not only because the New Deal, the original New Deal of the 1930s, was a somewhat successful program, at least to the extent that economic recovery and social policies were concerned, but also because it marked a point of change in which a public domain was opened and strengthened with the explicit aim of generating a robust recovery and a sustainable and a growth path that is sustainable economically, socially, and today environmentally. The New Deal wasn't perfect as a program; actually had many shortcomings, but it charted a promising way that is a realistic alternative to the failed neoliberal agenda. So the Global New Deal focuses on investment, rebalancing of labor incomes, better social spending, transfers, and appropriate guidelines to make sure that investments in the green transition and the energy transition happen. Whereas the neoliberal agenda tends to address growth by fueling debt, for example, for consumption or also for investment, it tends to address the development problem by promoting liberalizations. The Global New Deal tends to address growth by strengthening incomes so that spending can come out of income, not out of debt. It tends to wants to promote development by legitimizing structural transformation and the necessary investments, and most importantly, by putting again the state in the driving seat, so that it can start the programs that are necessary for this transition. Now, out of all the challenges that a program like this faces, it's important to realize at least two main points that we see as determining the current moment. One is that no country, no matter how big, can by itself make a difference here. I mean, everybody can do something useful, but all countries have to move together in a very strongly coordinated agenda for a program like this to be effective. And this opens the horizon to promising scenarios in which addressing the environmental challenge and addressing the stagnation of the economy and the social instability can be done in consistent ways. So we don't have to choose between rebalancing a very unjust society and the distribution of income or addressing the climate crisis. Of course, we have to make major changes, but what we are arguing in the report is that scenarios are possible in which these things go together. However, for this to happen, there are some tremendous obstacles in the way they need to be addressed. And some of the most formidable obstacles are the features of the current multilateral institutions that prevent countries from implementing the necessary policies that occupy their policy space, that in the form of trade and investment agreements that limit the countries' abilities to implement even the most basic social policies in some cases, basically block the road to these solutions. The final and most important question here is, of course, how do you pay for it? Which is what the provocative title of today is. And there's many ways to pay for it. There's for sure the need to encourage the private sector to contribute, but the private sector in itself, just as it wasn't the savior of the world during the financial crisis, it cannot be the savior of the world in the face of the climate crisis. But there are important sources of funding that are overlooked. Some funding is wasted in the form of macroeconomic mismanagement. Some funding is hidden, like the capital transfers that we talked a moment ago, and the rampant tax evasion that affects some countries. Some funding is misused or abused, like the trillions of dollars that engross central bank balance sheets, and the money that goes into fossil fuel subsidies, for example. Not to say that all of it is wasted, but it's a lot of resources that go in a direction that certainly makes the problem worse, while perhaps addressing other issues. And some funding is badly postponed, like the aid commitments that account for something like $3.4 trillion. Now, all of this in itself is already a substantial chunk of the resources needed to finance a program like this. And so our main message is there are scenarios that allow us to face all these challenges at once, but these scenarios face the hurdle of a multilateral system that needs to be appropriately reformed as a priority. And these are, in fact, the most important things to discuss and to attack head on, even more importantly than the actual public-private partnerships and the specific funding mechanisms that are necessary to gather private funds. Thank you very much.
I don't know if it's on.
I'll speak loudly, but if the mic is on, that will better. So yes, so economists, I'm not going to way of thinking about the field. Starting point is how economists 20%. Oh, I see. The climate change is the problem of the 21st century. The problem of the 21st century is climate change. The urgency of the problem is recognized by the form in which the response take. Economists tend to approach this problem in a framework of scarcity, as we approach many problems. That the problem is the allocation of limited resources among alternative uses. If you approach the problem of climate change from that point of view, then you frame the question in terms of what do we have to give up in order to preserve a more habitable planet in the future. How much do we have to reduce consumption today in order to raise living standards in the future? That's obviously the kind of work, Nobel Prize, if you approach climate change in that framework. And the financing question is similar. The problem of raising the funds to pay for whatever public spending is associated with the response, whether it comes from taxes or debt or some other form, is a cost that needs to be weighed against alternative uses of that capacity. So I think in some ways, one way of thinking about what the Green New Deal is fundamentally, because we know this term is in use much more widely than there's any agreement on what concretely it refers to, but I think one way of thinking about what the Green New Deal is an effort to get out of that framework, get out of that paradigm, to change the conversation around decarbonization away from this framework of scarcity and towards a different framework, and in particular also to move away from thinking of prices as the centerpiece of our response to decarbonization to one where we think about public investment as the centerpiece. And by doing this, we shift the conversation from one in which the economic problem of decarbonization is a problem that has to be solved. It's something that's going to impose costs on us in other respects, to a framework in which decarbonization, in fact, offers a solution to our most pressing economic problem. To me, that's sort of the heart of the Green New Deal vision. So what are those problems? Well, 80 years ago, as most of us know, John Maynard Keynes wrote in the General Theory, the outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and income. I think 80 years later, most of us agree that those are still the outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live. And we might add a third fault, which is the failure of private financial markets as the central economic coordinating mechanism. The failure of private finance either to provide a steady flow of income and production, its proneness to crises and booms, and its failure to allocate our collective resources to activities which we think are actually socially valuable. It's rewarding of certain kinds of activity and discouragement of other kinds of activity that don't, we think, reflect any genuine priorities we have as a society. So I think we can argue, and I think this report makes, in fact, a very compelling argument that the Green New Deal as a program offers us a solution to these problems. Obviously, the problem of unemployment in the U.S. today doesn't appear as urgent a problem, but if we take a longer view, we look back and we can see that, even if we take, for instance, the NIRU, the official unemployment target used by the Fed, If we look back to 1980, we'll find that in 192 months, the U.S. has been at least 1 point above that level, the unemployment rate, and only 18 months below it by at least 1 point. In other words, for at least 40 years, or close to 40 years, we've consistently overshot even the official unemployment target here in the United States. We can see a decline in labor force participation in the United States. It's not attributable to demographic factors and so on. Output, again, if we even use the benchmark of the official measures of potential output, there have been long periods of shortfall and only very brief and limited periods where output has been above that measure. 7 years after the end of the last recession to get back to what was considered potential output in the United States. In much of the world, this problem is even worse. We know in Europe, for instance, we've essentially had a decade of stagnation with real per capita income growth less than 0.5% over the past decade. And obviously in some countries, performance is much worse. In other parts of the world, obviously it's a mix. Continue to enjoy strong growth in incomes and employment, but many other parts of the world that have not. We can say that secular stagnation is still a global problem, perhaps the central macroeconomic problem facing the world, chronic inadequacy of demand to fully mobilize our collective resources. And again, we think this shortfall is much greater than the official measures of potential capture, that we think hysteresis is real. We think that labor force participation responds strongly to employment conditions. We can see in many countries outright deflation or inflation that is below what we target. We see low wage growth, a falling labor share. We see productivity growth that is slow, probably reflecting weak demand. So on many dimensions, we can see that in a broad sense, unemployment continues to be one of the problems of our economic. Obviously, inequality is an even more visibly acute problem, even more than when Keynes wrote. The share of income and wealth at the very top of the distribution is even higher today and continuing to get larger. And financial failure of financial markets is pretty visible. The solutions the Green New Deal offers to this, and I should say these problems are likely to become even more acute in the near future, as Jeronim was saying. We're almost the consensus certainly has shifted in the direction that the world is likely to face further downward shifts in demand. New cyclical downturns in the U.S. and other developed countries, much more likely than a takeoff of inflation. So the demand shortfalls that we already face are likely to be larger rather than smaller. So the Green New Deal offers the problem of decarbonization offers us perhaps the only problem other than war, which is acute enough to get us to the level of public spending that we need in order to close some of this demand shortfall. We still, in academic macroeconomics, people still talk about deficit bias. You'll find people like Simon Wren-Lewis writing long articles, explaining all sorts of complicated fiscal mechanisms you need to overcome the inherent deficit bias of elected governments. But when we look around the world today, we don't see deficit bias. We see a profound austerity bias. We see institutions that have been set up to hold back and restrain public spending, even in conditions when even sort of orthodox economic opinion would say that levels of spending are too low and that higher public spending and higher public debt would be perfectly okay. We can see many countries around the world where very visible, Germany and other where the problem of deficit bias is clearly the opposite of what we're actually observing. So to overcome this entrenched deficit bias, you need a problem sufficiently urgent to motivate governments to actually increase public spending and to try to pull up private spending in various ways as well. And again, it's likely that decarbonization is perhaps the only problem urgent enough to do that. Certainly, simply making the case for a chronic shortfall of demand for secular stagnation, although we should continue to do that, clearly is not a sufficient argument to shift fiscal policy in the direction that it needs to go. On the inequality front, I think the Green New Deal really contributes in two ways. One is that, again, if we want to make a case for higher taxes, and especially any sort of global tax on income and wealth, clearly that's a very difficult political problem under any circumstances, particularly if we want to do it at a global level. And again, it seems unlikely that without an urgent public financing problem like massive investment needed to overcome decarbonization, you're unlikely to make much headway in most parts of the world, and certainly not on any sort of global tax on income and wealth. So linking that to decarbonization and particularly to obviously a program of public investment for decarbonization, probably the strongest way you can make the case for a radical redistribution effort that form. But I think even more important than that is simply the effect that closing that demand shortfall will have on income distribution. I think that if we look back historically, we can say that there's really no more powerful force for income distribution, and particularly for the labor share, than sustained tight labor market, sustained full employment. The example of World War II is a very clear case of this, where you had an extreme compression of incomes almost everywhere, countries that were involved in the war and countries not directly involved in the war, in the absence of, I think in most cases, any sort of systematic effort to engage in downward redistribution. Most countries did not have particularly progressive tax and transfer systems during the war. In fact, there was much more often effort to restrain wage growth. And yet the compression of incomes and the rise in the wage share during the war really dwarfed anything I think that we can see before or since. If we look at the U.S., which was not directly affected by the war, Japan or France, we'll see that this is the period in which incomes became more equal and which labor share rose. A country like Canada, people sometimes say this is because of the destruction of capital during the war. I think that's a silly answer. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't correspond to what capital actually is, which relationship, and it also doesn't describe the historical facts. A country like Canada that was free of any sort of direct wartime destruction, nonetheless, almost the entire reduction of incomes during income inequality of the Great Compression of the mid-20th century happened during the wartime year, about 3/4 of it, I believe. So the effect of high-pressure labor market, the effect of strong, sustained, high demand on income distribution really is hard to exaggerate. And again, the problem we face is what kind of pressure, what kind of motivation could lead public policy in the direction of delivering those sustained tight labor markets. And I think the Green New Deal and this public investment-led approach to climate change is by far the most promising there. And then finally, on the financial side, we have this fundamental problem of, on the one hand, this chronic mismatch between the assets that wealth holders and financial institutions want to hold and the assets that are need to be issued to finance real activity. We've got this immense demand for safe, liquid assets only a handful of borrowers can issue. And then we've got a large other set of economic units that even in an environment of abundant liquidity and very low interest rates are actually set out of financial markets or are only able to borrow very unfavorable terms. We've got this chronic mismatch between the assets that wealth holders want to hold and the assets that need to be issued to finance real activity. And then we've got also a chronic failure of markets to direct investment in any sort of rational way, even by the criteria of private utilities. Booms and busts, misdirection investment. The Green New Deal creates a space for us to solve these problems, both by creating more safe liquid debt that actually finances socially useful activity through various mechanisms, whether it's the Green Investment Bank, debt, other mechanisms that allow us to issue, or governments with fiscal capacity to issue more debt in the United States, to issue debt in order to finance public spending, but some way of linking the kind of safe asset production to the activity of spending on decarbonization. And it also creates the opportunity for us to move in the direction of credit policy, create, as the report talks about, either have central banks or new institutions or actively direct credit for socially valuable uses. Important both to finance private on decarbonization and more generally create a financial I'll just end on that point. The story of the 2000s in many ways was this demand for safe assets, reserve assets, developing countries help secure themselves against financial flows that, in a certain sense, of financing the boom in housing and the growth of housing debt in the United States. Reverse outcome, the Green New Deal on one level gives us a chance to recreate something like that dynamic, but in a sustainable, socially useful way. We can channel that need for safe assets, financial urgent.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying I agree. Very compelling. Today. part of the discussion uh, it has been initiated by the TDR is what about international? I was at the United Nations when the financial crisis hit. I was the head of the Chief Executive Board Secretariat. Working with the General, we convened the entire United Nations, including head, at have the crisis meeting about how we address twin financial crisis, and at that time, if you recall, there was a crisis breaking down major. There was an intensive discussion. There was a lot of support from the Bretton Woods side for bailout. So voices from the other side, UNCTAD, which was that when the identical financial crisis hit East Asia previously, everybody had talked about moral hazard bailing out banks. How the must never bail out the bank. The logic of capitalism, failing institutions fall, and that rising is. Nevertheless, the bailout happened. Bailout was supposed to address the structural problem. We knew at that time there were about $4 trillion system. Financial institution was seen. And what we see today is an analogous. You know much better than me about Pacific. But we still have massive in the system. We have financial assets that nobody knows still very much. All this talk about oncoming recession has a lot to do. So what institutional risk did and when been major press conference, journalists hard hit it, and we went home. That was as far the internet. So the Bretton Woods institution have been created macroeconomic balance at the end of the war that actually forced neoliberal orthodox in the global economy. And I remember very well in the early year when for the World Bank as a citizen of an African at the ringside seat about how neoliberal economic policy and austerity forced Africa created what we call the post-development. So where are we now? We have on one side this whole issue with how to develop power investment kind of infrastructure. But at the same time, we have a mega trend of climate. Is now reinventing the So I'm going to focus on aspect energy. State is a new organization for renewable energy. And what we have seen is that 2/3 carbon emissions come from if we are going to attack decarbonization, energy, but we have major kind of struggle going on. To look at it from the institutional, there are no institutions that have any norm. That's by design. We have IEA, which is 70. The IEA's central role was to protect control oil reserve, eastern crisis, and for helping OECD countries balance. The way the IEA has built that the IEA analysis about consistently, dramatic undershot that. When we created this new organization, energy, it began to take many. But the essential issue was, can countries find affordable, sustainable energy? 15 is a period last 10 years, last decade. Renewables, capacity addition, global power supply, 7 years. Very interesting aspect that last 3 years, every year, best renewable power emerging is outstripped. But nevertheless, we don't have an answer on how this is happening through entrepreneurship and opportunity. And you are beginning to see geopolitical, a very have on the one side, world is doubling down. On the other side, you have development of technology as any energy, renewable heat, but we still power vested. The big oil companies have a market. Very big, where we were looking at it claimed how that extraordinary. So what it shows is that there is now a very dynamic struggle thing. Not smooth as the business model and the advent of very powerful private renewable. First, what we're going to see as we reach on going to have tremendously going to see 9 grow their sit. We're going to see huge fight new disrupt and don't those institutions energy very well. Hardly happen. On a very we have from a developer. We don't want to hear. There is a angle which we are taking. Investment, public, enable this transit, enable growth, employment. That's the direction. Where are the
Just keep your direction. Okay. Well, thank you and good morning, everyone. Just a question. How many economists are there in this room? We can. Okay, just double checking. Huh? Oh, just double checking. But first of all, of course, I need to thank UNCTAD and the New School for bringing us together, and also my fellow panelists. And I'm very happy that Ms. Abrahamian is here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have sat in this panel. Because during this year of tenure, I never sat in a panel that doesn't have gender parity. And sorry to say that, but perhaps here it doesn't, in this academic environment, it doesn't mean a lot. But a political statement at the UN had to be made because we are not looking at the gender side of the dialogue and of the intelligence, of the capacity of making contributions on this issue that is so important. And of course, I think that I would like, of course, I cannot speak as an economist, but because I'm a geographer, and I've been listening very, very attentively to the incredible wealth of information and analysis this morning from your respective standpoints, and basically, I want to be very honest with you. I had like a 9-page speech. And I'm sure that you really don't want to go through the pain of me reading a 9-page. But basically, I would like to share with you 3 ideas. The number one is that I think that this year report on trade and development by UNCTAD called the Global Green New Deal and the financing of the Global Green New Deal, I think it was extremely timely. The content of it is extremely powerful. Basically, what I see is that it is some kind of a roadmap, a blueprint of the what to do that we are lacking so much, especially at the UN and within the multilateral system. And when I hear that, it makes all sense to me, even if I'm not an expert on these issues, but it does make sense. How is basically the message is how is that we build a new social contract where the cycles of the economy connect to the cycles of nature and connect to the cycles of society. And I think that in itself is extremely powerful. But then here the downsides are that, first of all, for this to happen, we need some requisites. And the number one, perhaps, is that our multilateral system works properly. And unfortunately, it is not. It is not, because this cannot be a recipe for, a very innovative country out there to just do the right thing, because it's impossible. You know better than I do, how trade works, how, the interconnection of the energy matrices work. And Adnan was very clear about that, on how the commodity chains work. So it is impossible for one country to do the right thing in isolation. So we do need a supporting scaffold that in the ideal world should be the multilateral financial institutions. But unfortunately, what we're seeing out there, it's also a lack of, shared narrative. We see the IMF, I don't understand, and then I'll explain why I don't understand, but then the World Bank and the regional banks in trying to do fundamentally the same thing, but doing it differently and confusing the countries in a big way. And here I'm speaking as a politician. And I'm not, I'm not afraid of saying, I am a politician. And as a politician, what is that you need when you want to do good for your country? You need a clear footprint, a clear, not footprint, a clear blueprint or a clear navigation map. And then you need to know how to do it, but how to do it in consonance with the international community. And what I see that doesn't happen. Even within the UN, as president of our parliament, because the world has a parliament, which is the General Assembly, where we take all the decisions, the normative decisions, that then translate into policies for countries. Of course, I have also an academic background, like all of you. And when I received the report, the last SDG report, perhaps I would like to say a few words on that, of the independent experts on the last SDG report. When I received the UNDESA reports, the UN Division on Economic and Social Affairs of the UN, when I see what UNCTAD is producing, when I see what UNDP is producing in the regional economic commissions such as ECLAC, and of course I go and look at that. But then what you see is an enormous amount of data and information that is completely disconnected and that doesn't provide a clear navigation map. And we feel as countries, especially in the global south, I am from Ecuador, but then, please give me a simpler list of what to do. And if you read a report from UNDES, it's completely something else. It doesn't have anything to do with this year report on trade and development for UNCTAD. Not only there are different views and different policy advices, but there are conflicting views within the UN on the what to do. Perhaps it's really not politically correct what I'm saying, but that's the real situation. And when you say, well, perhaps the multilateral system needs to deliver better, and of course, needs to deliver better. And I've been working a lot this year. We passed a resolution for a process next year I see as a golden opportunity to reinvigorate the narrative of multilateralism, of what is the kind of multilateral system we need, for example, to deliver on the sustainable development. What is that we need to do? And it is not only about money, about the arithmetics of wise investment. It is about understanding, for example, that the role of the state is extremely important. And here again, I'm not being politically correct, because we are in the last day of high-level week, where the entire framing of our own communication was about partnership, the role of the private sector, which is very important, by the way, the role of the private sector and what is the private sector going to do. If you look, for example, at the climate commitments, we saw climate commitments that were much more ambitious from the private sector than from leaders and member states. But in this equation, no matter what happened, the way I understand, not as an economist, but as a politician, is that if we do not have the policy space for the state to take seriously the issue of public investment, for example, in decarbonization and all other strategic areas of the economy, we are in big trouble. I have 1 minute, I'm told. And basically, perhaps to summarize, yesterday, basically this week we had a choreography. As president of the General Assembly, I was in charge of organizing the choreography for this week. So we started with the climate summit that was organized by for everybody to meet and scale up ambition on mitigation, basic decarbonization. So the numbers are there. We haven't seen exactly what is the sum of the commitments that were made, but the money basically, yes, is going to be, to come from the private sector, the renewable energy company, the banking sector, which sign an agreement of responsible banking, proper investment, etc. Very little from the government side, I would say. The second day was about the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, to look at what has happened. Can I use a couple of more minutes or not? Otherwise, I'll just stop here. Okay. I'm only, because I looked at the time, I'm only speaking 7 minutes. Okay, but it's fine. So, second day on the Sustainable Development Goals and on the report. Basically, what we were told is that we have gone backwards on 4 issues, clearly backward. On mitigation, climate mitigation and carbon reduction. Number 2, on biodiversity loss. We are really very close to facing a major extinction crisis. The number 3 is waste management. And the number 4 is inequalities. And the common thread among these 4 is women and girls' rights. We are really in bad state. And what to do, because this is not only about a global Green New Deal. It is not only about decarbonizing the economy. In my opinion, the climate crisis is not a problem. It's a symptom. It is a symptom. And the symptom is that we do need now to take seriously, the need for a new social contract. I was trying to look at some 3 questions that I would like to pause before I close, because you are the expert, but I have few questions. The number 1 question is, if we have had decades of very poor results of structural adjustment in combating poverty and inequality, but yet the structural adjustment models continue to exist and continue to really put a lot of stress in our country. And I am speaking about a country who just signed an agreement with the IMF last. Why is that? We know that austerity measures, privatization of strategic sectors, weakening of the public policy space does not work, and yet we continue to think that that's perhaps the normal thing to do. The number 2 question is that we already know for years that to put a lot of weight on the philanthropic sector and on the private sector is not good enough. It's not good enough because I think we have a problem in defining 2 words, and the one word is profit. Why? How is that we define profit? How is that economists define profit? For me, profit, the only profit that perhaps I can understand is profit that would bring well-being to society, social cohesion, and would maintain our life support system operating. Perhaps we need to rethink the word profit. And perhaps the third and last question is, we say, it's so promising, the green jobs, the renewable energies, economy is going to be different because we have this incredible opportunity. And yet we are $2.5 billion a year short in financing the sustainable development. So my question is, what is that we need to do to have a multilateral system that can enhance and boost the role of states, accountable, responsible, democratic states, to take the lead on the need to really rethink our international multilateral financial institution. So that I would like to end by that, and to say that next year, for the 75th anniversary of the UN, I think we do have an opportunity to talk the talk, to resignify, to come up with new narratives, to re-understand and redefine words such as profit, but also words such as greed. I'm not an English speaker, but I think that the word greed should be at the table, and we should discuss, because this is what is, has taken us where we are now, which is not only a climate crisis, but which is not only a macroeconomic crisis. I think it is a civilizatory crisis that requires a new social contract.
Thank you. Espinosa, which is how to have national multilateral new challenge. I hope that we have 5 hours better, but I'll try to. In very, let me say, Ambassador, we like to not be in the that at least some little bit of representation here we should be aware of. And I never participate in any panel that is not okay. But having said that, let me start by saying that I completely agree. I'm a little bit biased by TDR, work TDR, and I love the TDR, always precious, goes straight to the point. So I'll take having said that, I can go a little bit beyond, be a little bit specific. Completely agree with how I have to make a disclaimer. I'm a senior fellow of WRI, also known as Brooklyn Institution. I'm not a professor anymore at the University of Rio de Janeiro, but nothing what I'm going to say here necessarily represents. So, Professor Josh, you said, no. Okay, good. Said something that I find as a macroeconomist, what you said to me resonates so well. I do see the enormous potential of moving towards a low carbon growth to solve many of the issues of unemployment, productivity, quality jobs, and so many other issues that we have to do that. By the way, I reinvented myself. I was talking to Professor Setterfield that I met as a macroeconomist. I began my life as a banker, then I became a heterodox macroeconomist because I thought I could change the word that by then, and it was extremely necessary to do that. And I reinvented myself to become an environmentalist and joined the WRI because WRI, and this is the only mention that I want to make, does do what Professor Manson has mentioned. It looks at the evidence, at the hard evidence on how going towards a low carbon growth path can generate all these outcomes. With hard evidence, we're talking about, using science, not just not economic, if you can call that science, but hard evidence to do that. I'm working that I just joined a month ago, and on a project for Brazil, for Colombia, and several other countries to make the case that low carbon growth can lead to all this macroeconomic consequences. But let me put back my hat on finance, and I only have 6 minutes now. But I want you to go very quick. I'm also very much interested in the Bretton Woods from the start. I worked at the World Bank for many years. I was in all the discussions of the multilateral systems after the crisis, the G20, with BRIC, with the G77, name it. I was also in the discussions how to, after the crisis and the pressure that we had, things were going to change very quickly, what we had to do. And since I was a young scholar, I was interested in the Bretton Woods, of course, being a Keynesian myself. I read quite a lot of that. The most recent one that I read, a book by Ed Conway, I suggest you should read, which is called The Summit. It's fascinating because the narrative that you have there is pretty similar to the one on finance that you have in the video. The narrative is more or less like this. Finance is a genius. Peter knew that, Keynes knew that, even Bixel as economist knew that. Finance is what makes transformations happen in market economy, since market economy can be called. The potential of finance to transform when it allied with the goals of transformations are incredible. I don't want to go into that. It's all there, but this is the narrative. Finance was, in the Bretton Woods, was a genius that was put in some constraints, not back into the bottle, in order to make it functional for the transformation required, which was the reconstruction of the economies after the war, some of the economies later on for the development process and so on. Finance in Bretton Woods broke down in the 70s and became era of liberalization, and the genius was set free in a way that transformed itself into evil, the same evil that ended destroying the world economy before the war, and that ended up destroying our world economy system in 2008. And since then, it's been out there. We need to reform that, and I believe this is what it is. And my only concern is this. My only concern about this narrative is what comes out. I agree with the whole narrative, and I think it's necessary to rethink the international relations. I think that we're looking at the wrong side. We're looking at the wrong act. Why? So this genius that we want to reform is going big. Is, as we speak now, is smoking a cigar, surrounded by lobbyists and bankers, somewhere around here, planning on how to counteract what the TR. This is the nature. It's not. I'm not even saying that. Oh, there's an evil people. It's the nature of the business. I know because I was a banker once, and I know that the easiest way of making money is what you're going to follow. And the easiest ways to make money is by countering the free regulations and all the rules that are proposed by the concerned international community. So how do it's not going to be reformed that way, my view, and this is what I want. This is the only caveat that but you have to find a way around it. The way around it is to look at other. It's to look at, for instance, the force that you have as a pensioner, as a German pensioner. I was listening the beautiful speech by Greta Thunberg. And I would suggest that she's completely right to talk to the United Nations. But she should also talk to the Association of Pensioners in Germany, which has trillions of dollars there, and say, you know what? Why don't you decide from now on, as a pensioner, you're only going to invest in investment funds that invest in bring back assets. This would be tremendous change in diverting resources. Not only that, talk also to the parliaments and to the politicians and say to them, from now on, we don't want you just to say that we want to put $100 billion in that. We want you to have a policy to transfer technologies in order to create the pipelines of green projects that developing countries need in order to create all that. I hope I'm not jumping to it. You can go also to the financial regulations. The bankers were here, the central bankers were here, discussing financial regulations. Oh, Ambassador Espinosa, there was a great moment to say, just put climate risk into the portfolio allocation in Basel. Just say, BIS, don't, to say something silly, but I want just request the bank put climate risk in insurance fund, which they should be doing because the assets are stranded in fossil fuel or assets that are not resilient to climate change. I will give you an example. Real estate. How in California that nowadays the pension funds in California would only invest in assets that are not are climate resilient. Only by doing that, if you can change the investments towards sustainable infrastructure, that would create a massive flow of financial. Third thing, there's a cryptocurrency boom now, and they have just created a market for that, which is regulated. Why not create a green cryptocurrency? Because one of the things, for those who are not into these things, I'm not. I'm a horrible investor. I lose money with things, but I follow at least, okay? What cryptocurrency allows you to do is to have a tracking because of the way it's structured of the operations from the Bitcoins all the way to whatever investment is underpinning that operation. So if you say from now on, you know what, I would only operate with companies that use green cryptocurrency, which are backed by investments in green infrastructure and so on. So what I'm trying to say to you is that we are knocking on the wrong door. We are asking the genius, including the multilaterals. And by the way, answering to you, Ambassador Espinosa, again, and you had a very important points raised. If we talk to the World Bank, I was in the World Bank, and I was into the system from the governance side, but also as an economist, to say, well, we should be allowing national development banks to be the focal points of the new international financial systems to transform, to make that transformation. It's only humane that say, no, hold. I want you to be the one in control of it. I can have a long conversation about it. There's no way we can transform the billions into trillions to financing low carbon growth in developing countries if you don't have local actors acting to leverage those resources and interacting with the policymakers in order to make that possible. And even translating the $100 billion, we talk billions, we need billions. To transform that into the trillions that we need to have those domestic actors. The multilateral system, as any humane institution, does not want to do that. They want to be the one owning the whole, holding the gate of the process, which makes things worse. So we have to rethink, investor, and I suggest to you all, we have to rethink ways around the genius that are there smoking the cigar. Okay? And I think that the only way you can do that, I wish I a little bit more, but it's 12 minutes. We have to think of innovative ways, not innovative ways in the sense that the TDR is correct, say that, which reproduces the same kind of action. We have to find ways where there's dynamism, both in the political point of view and the economic point of view and the financial point of view, and leverage. And by the way, this is something after listen to the young entrepreneurs. I'm not talking about these entrepreneurs making gadgets. Entrepreneurs changing, creating disruptive innovations, not only in the technological sense, but in the financial market. And you're going to see that there's a lot out there that we are not, a lot of people, a lot of new things happening that we are not looking at. You know why? Because we are old. Not you all here. I'm getting old, and I noticed that. The system is old, and this is not just saying that we have gray hairs, because we're thinking about the same structure that allow us to do the transformation that we need in the 19th century. And now we have something completely new, and I would say even bigger challenge than we had. Go ahead.
Thanks for all your contributions. I won't speak for too long. I'm not an economist. I do have questions and some thoughts. I read the report, most of the report, maybe not all of the charts, and I found it remarkably fluid. And I think that a lot of the time, reports that come out from international institutions tend to be disconnected from what people are talking about, disconnected from reality sometimes, certainly disconnected from mainstream media. And this isn't the case. It is totally commonsensical, and I'm biased. I work at a left-wing political magazine. It seems very commonsensical. The issue is that even if it is as commonsensical as it seems, there is still a huge disconnect, a question of narratives in the world. And I think we can roughly split, ignoring the large companies, split people into two groups. People like myself, who think this is great but would really like to know how we can help, and people who don't buy it at all and who might be more inclined to vote for a populist. As we now know, high-level international policies, agreements, and ideas are catnip for populists. Sometimes promoting these ideas has the opposite effect. It makes people react poorly and think, oh, this isn't democratic, which it isn't always democratic. We have no control over this. We need to, take back control. So my question is for all of you, how do you help if you are for it? And how do you sell this global Green New Deal to people who might be inclined to be very against it from the outset? Any volunteers?
Start with a disclaimer, I smoke an occasional cigar, but I make sure they're Cuban. Let me say, I think that, Professor saying opening remarks about nativism, the racism that characterizes current concept is a political tool. I don't think it's a real issue. Political fear far more inability to manipulate than conflict. And I think we have to bring back and realistic opportunity based on a more that vision is not 19 preparing. That is development of technology, education, social progress, and investment new type of growth. We have all we have sector different biodiversity, but social natural benefit. Investment in clean energy. The fact that investment in clean energy is generating more jobs, any investment existing. The fact that new technology, ability, beginning to take part of the cost of deindustrializing, create immiseration. I think essentially my one thing would let's develop positive narrative, quality and empowerment. That includes a country. That becomes a dominant narrative. Future. That a divisive way.
Yeah, if I can just build on that and amplify it, because I think it's exactly the right answer. I think in terms of dealing with this populist resentment, I mean, it's two obviously things, there's an element of national sovereignty, but I think that's really just a language people use. I think real fear is just that people are going to be really worse off. The way these proposals have been made and reinforce those fears. So I think the most important thing is that we really frame our response to climate change and our proposals for decarbonization in terms of things that are going to make people materially better off and raise people's living standards, incomes, economic today. Not just, it's certainly for our grandchildren, also creating jobs and economic security and a higher standard today. And that means obviously, first of all, the public investment first approach, carbon tax approach really does make most people worse off. It means, I think, absolutely giving this more optimistic vision of the world as well, making it clear that a world that is not so carbon intensive is not a world of scarcity and poverty, and it's actually a world in which most people's lives are going to be better. Kate Aronoff, who's sitting over there, wrote a very nice piece at the internet about the idea of that actually you can easily imagine many ways in which decarbonization makes you happier. Decarbonization. This is a proposal to transform the world in a way that actually will make us happier, enjoy life more, give us more of the things that we really want. I think it has to be generous. And then I think a more sort of autonomous turn on that, which is also critical, emphasize how much how much wasted, how much excess resource capacity we have economically, how underutilized so many people's labor are, how many people either out of the labor force, really worthless, low value, unsatisfying work, who in a real crash are doing much more satisfying, much rewarding, much better paid jobs. There's an enormous space. It's not a matter of, but I think if you don't go right in there, if you don't frame your proposal as a way that is directly going to improve people's living standards today, especially of course in the communities and places that are most dependent on fossil fuels, then you're setting yourself an impossible task. So I think that's the the critical piece. I think the question of whether these things are implemented nationally or internationally, you can if you're actually delivering benefits to people, you can manage that stuff. The question of what to do, I guess, is a harder question. I think in some ways I feel like, at least in the sort of democratic policy world of the United States, I think the Green New Deal perspective actually makes progress. I think there's a lot less focus on a carbon tax even a year ago among people in that world. A lot more openness to a big program of public investment. I think I think in some ways, the macro question, what I do and what I'm interested in, maybe is a less pressing one. We really need to be talking about really concrete. Okay, saying public investment. What concrete are you going to be spending the money? What do we actually need to do now, and how do we do it?
Well, I had one more question for the left of me side of the room, and that's about the private sector. And I'll leave this very broad. Is the best approach carrot or stick? I'm talking about the banks, the oil companies, not the green energy startups.
Carrot and stick, both. Very quickly. And I think that we put perhaps too much hope and pressure to the private sector. I think that the public sector and strong government, we need to have action. And I say we because I've worked in a government many years. And if you allow me very, very, I would say that first of all, I think that we need to in the communication, because basically things that in this room us of urbanization, now very. If you tell people that basically 9 world are breathing under that are I experienced I have that when I'm when we speak about and especially, well, except for the movement, are taxing CO2 things. With climate means more jobs, healthier lives, and here are the numbers. We are losing the regarding populism, nationalism, etc. I think we really need to make the case for that word is difficult in English. To translate that. The translation work, it's much needed. But it's funny, this week we had, I think, 130, perhaps 140 of state and government at the UN. And they stood at the podium of the United Nations calling for nationalist response, anti-globalism, standing in the, the place where global leaders meet, reach agreement, find. It's good because it means that all that life that we want to, we need to make a better use of.
I think our what
our message to both the activists and the skeptics. Our two messages they're very much one. But we are saying we're saying to the activists, well, reclaim economic security in with your activist work. This is something that we've largely forgotten. Right now, we're talking about employment. These days, we're talking about employment in a somewhat subdued way, because employment is not a synonym of economic security anymore, because of the pressure on wage bargaining, because of the liberalization of labor markets. And so employment, we celebrate low unemployment rates, historically low unemployment rates in the world, not just in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but it doesn't speak to people's ability to have a livelihood that can lead them to a fulfilling existence. So the message for activists is, this is a regressive trend that can be reversed. So a progressive reclaiming of economic security as an expectation, as a feature of communal living is certainly the North Star of social action, and the climate dimension of it is a very prominent dimension. Because a lot of climate action can come. Actually, a lot of the climate crisis and its effects are tremendously unequal, and they actually contribute to the economic inequalities that already exist. Well, we're also saying to the activists, we're also saying in developing countries, industrialization is still a fundamental step for their countries to upgrade their productive systems. But industrialization doesn't have to necessarily go the way that it went for the past century and a half in the nowadays developed countries. But it can be a much greener proposition with the appropriate international rules and the appropriate support. The flip side of the story is that what we, as the TDR is saying to the skeptics is, we recognize that we live in an age of anxiety, precisely because that economic security doesn't exist anymore in the way that it did only 30 years ago. The tariff conflicts that we see these days are a very real face of it, but that's another example of a very real issue that is a symptom of a larger malaise rather than a problem in itself. The whole discussion on the trade wars is focused on the tariff confrontation as if affecting any change in the trade balance would actually make a substantial difference to people's lives in the United States and in China. We see a little bit of these changes. We see some rearrangement in value chains. That's not what's driving this problem. What's driving this problem is there is a struggle for technology transfer that is a very understandable and legitimate transfer of a middle-income country that wants to break. That's China, who wants to break the middle-income barrier and needs to acquire and use the technology necessary for that. And that, unfortunately, creates tensions that have to do with the general rearrangement or the general bargaining around influence in the world. But this is a real problem that, of course, needs to be addressed. But it will not. This whole tariff confrontation, no matter how far it goes, it's not going to address or resolve the economic insecurity that is plaguing so many people. But we're saying to the skeptics, look back. Look to the 30 plus years of hyper globalization and financialization in this economy, and you recognize a lot of the agendas of the movements that we call populists recognize that this agenda has not served them, but we're also saying, look, there is an alternative narrative. The alternative narrative is the Global Green New Deal. It is a narrative that targets real problems and says, well, let's make sure the state takes the lead and and attacks those problems and let the private sector follow. And is it carrot or stick? I gotta say, as a former horse riding enthusiast, it's neither carrot nor stick, or both. It's train. So it's important to establish a constructive lead by the state with all the regulation that, of course, that's necessary to make sure the private sector follows. But we also have to make a distinction between within this big universe of the private sector. There is an enormous amount of private sector activity that is speculative finance that has no social value. And then, it's true that finance is a genius, but not all finance is a genius, or some of it is an evil genius. It doesn't really do anything good. Actually, it does a lot of bad things in the form of creating tremendous vulnerabilities. But that's a part of the private sector that has tremendous potential. There's the companies that actually would invest, that is, they would actually create productive capacity, employ people, develop technology, improve value chains and make important discoveries, but they will not do them alone. I mean, famous case is the one of the internet. The internet, it wasn't created by Google or Facebook. It was created by a consortium of countries, government investment, and on the side of Geneva, where there's a big lab where a side product of their nuclear physics research was the internet, together with the American military spending. This is the lead that I'm talking about, not the military. I'm talking the state-led investment. So that's, I think that's a message that we care about very much. And surely, again, just to hammer on this point that is very important, that it's the multilateral arrangements that maybe we don't discuss enough in developed countries, but are a major element and a major obstacle for a lot of countries that cannot implement any of these policies because they cannot implement capital controls, and they need to worry every day to keep the foreign capital at home. And they cannot do any public spending precisely for the same reason. And so that's definitely a first order of business, and together with really seriously considering any public option in this transition, in the policy transition that goes with it. And I want to answer Rogério's very slight provocation about the what to do with the genius element of finance. I think we're very much in line with that. I want to signal that there is an eminent persons panel report that was released in October about how we can use finance to implement the necessary investments. The panel has a wealth of proposals that tell us how we could use these asset classes and de-risk public and private investment. And all of this is absolutely well and good. And I agree that there's a lot that can be done. However, it makes an enormous difference whether we do this starting by creating these instruments and letting the private sector self-regulate, or expecting the private sector regulate, or whether we create these instruments, but at the same time we create all the safeguards and the regulation that allows us to channel those forces and that genius in a way that doesn't create the havoc.
Mrs. Abraham, I think I've read this chapter, theory 1,000 times. Easy because it was it's a one part. And the first chapter is about persuasion. This is pretty things was like bring back the discussion about. So basically, he's coming from a war that's been won. He knew that it would be fight, and he knew that finance ought to. And he said, I want to persuade that the market economy and the finance we have is not adequate to provide as economists have been saying. Now, most of your economists here, right? All in you have a big job, which is to make exactly what Kristen was saying, and this is my answer about carrot and stick. It's not about carrot and stick. It's about a business case. Just like King said, I suggest you to read over and over again chapter 1 and then go to the states of frustration and understand what first wants to grab. But it's about making a business case. To whom? I think the far most important is the common work. Transforming the world brings anxiety for anyone, but particularly those that are much more vulnerable to transformation, because they know who are the ones who are going to lose. We have to make a business case, and that's what Professor Masson and I have been saying, that this is going to bring you better job, better paid, in a more fulfilling part. This is the first business case. I'm sorry, WR has been doing that. A lot of economists have been that. We not have transformed that, and Ambassador Espinosa is talking on communication yet, into something simple to be delivered to the common work. Okay? The second business case is to the business community. I'll give an example. The day that I was walking here, 40 minutes conference station. Anyways, and there's a big country that has a crisis of fires in the tropical forest. Several other countries around. There's a big country that imports a lot of soybeans from that country. The other big country does not want to say anything that's politically correct. Say, I want you to deal with your sovereignty. And by the way, I don't import cattle a lot. I import mainly soybeans. But if you make that big country see that if you destroy the Amazon River, you also destroy the Golden River that brings the water all the way from the Amazon to California, you're going to see that the largest producer of soybean of the country will lose productivity and will be incapable to deliver soybeans to the other larger countries and to the other companies. You can also show to them that that big country exports a lot of leather to other countries in Europe. And those, the fact is that is going to have business consequences for you. If you do it a different way, it can be much better. I can show you. Okay? This is the business case, big business to finance. They already know. The bankers are scared because they know that the climate risk is going to affect business hard in the court. Just like they knew in 2008 that subprime was going to hit them bad. But there's a motion, you stuck into inertia because you say, well, why would I lose business now? Because I want to worry about the future in 6 months. So those are the business cases, Ambassador, that and Abraham, that we don't need sticks and carrots. We need business case. First of all, for the common work. Second, for big business in the world. Third, big time. This is how we're going to do it. If we keep asking old people to answer old questions, we'll never deliver. If you pose different questions in a different way and be innovative in finding or then I
Thank you so much for your responses. We're running a little short on time, and I'm not sure when we have to get out of this room, but I'll open this up to the audience if anyone has questions. Kate.
Thank you. My question is also about sticks, and just to say I really appreciated the panel. It seems right now like there is a lot of exciting news coming out of the renewable energy sector, but it's still not meaningfully cutting into the energy mix. Fossil fuels still contribute most of that. And part of that story is finance, right? There is still a lot of money from the finance system going into oil and gas, less so to coal, and after all this money flooded into the financial system after the crash, part of what resulted from that was the natural gas boom in the U.S., which sort of paradoxically brought down emissions, but if it's allowed to continue, will lock us into infrastructure that we can't reasonably expect to live to its full lifetime if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So I think there is a real business case to be made for a lot of sectors, right? For many, many sectors across the economy. I don't think there's a business case to be made to the fossil fuel industry to shut down its core business, right? And so my question is sort of twofold. I guess one is what are the sticks, right? What are the sticks that the multilateral institutions can leverage to constrain those? What can things like central banks do to cut down on both the investment side and sort of the business model of these companies themselves? And second, what on the more carrot end, what are the mechanisms to take all this money out of the speculative, useless activity that has resulted from all this new cash being introduced, and from the sort of destructive investments in the real economy in the form of the fossil fuel industry. I think the obvious thing is subsidies, but on a kind of level down from that, what are the means, whether that's industrial policy, whether that's sort of central bank policy, whether that's something the IMF or World Bank can do, kind of what are the real institutional mechanisms to do that with?
I think it's a very good question. But I think there is, sometimes we mistake the narrative, because the narrative is to take a snapshot of the existing situation without looking at the transformative trends that are taking place. So the snapshot of the existing situation is, if you look at the energy sector and the decarbonization of the energy sector, in the power sector, electricity, which accounts for certain proportions, say 33% energy, the renewable energy case is very strong. I think we have overcome the problems of intermittency, technology like smart metering, new technologies for the management of the grid allows, large-scale integration of variable renewables with absolute reliability today. And we have a lot of market reform and market design issues going on in the electricity sector, which is enabling that. The real issue is, what about the end-use sectors, which account for the bulk of energy use that we haven't been able to electrify? Heating, cooling, industry, transportation, freight, aviation, and so on. And I think that's where some really interesting things have started to happen. So for electricity, there is a very compelling business case, and we're beginning to see, I mentioned that the bulk of investment in power capacity in developing countries now is in renewable. I think for the other sectors is where the technological challenge comes. So also in a way reacting to the discussion that's taking place. So we have the advent of storage technologies, both for stationary applications and mobile applications, that are now improving exponentially, and the costs are coming down. We're seeing that electric mobility will be competitive for light transportation in the next 2 or 3 years, and continue that learning curve so that it'll become the choice for mobility in the future. We're seeing innovation regarding green hydrogen, which is becoming really one of those solutions that could potentially deal with the issues of cooling, heating, industrial heat, and freight. There are a lot of investments that are going into this. But then you have the tension on the other side, which is that the incumbency doesn't want to let go. I mean, clearly, if you have $2.5 trillion of market cap, and you have hundreds of thousands of jobs vested in this, and you have huge political tentacles that are able to influence government policy, you're not going to let go. So we're seeing the conflict right now between the advance of technology and the business case for clean technology and for a future low carbon industrialization, with an incumbency that has huge political power. So how That is the real interesting thing for me. How is that struggle going to be resolved in the coming 5 to 10 years? Because this is the critical point, and that's why these multilateral discussions are so important. And it's so, I love the UN. I gave 25 years of my life to international organizations. But to go and hear the same thing year after year after year after year, to hear voluntary commitments made on podiums that will never be fulfilled, to see people using talking points to create a picture that in reality, in terms of political reality, is not going to happen, it's kind of disenchanting. So I think we need a little more courage in the international space. We need to speak a little more truth to power. We need to name countries. I mean, Brazil, China, and the United States. If you like me to say that, I'm happy to say it. And we need to step up a little bit. And Maria Fernanda made a fundamental point. We underestimate the power of communication. I mean, I read your stuff. I've never seen you before, but I love what you're writing. And I think we need to be able to popularize that kind of message and accessible to people. And I remember in my youth, when I was a young undergraduate in England, I was at a very progressive university. Margaret Thatcher was elected. We had a coal miners' strike. So if you were a human being, you would be on the picket line with the miners, and that's where I encountered hard power in the form of a truncheon of a policeman. But I spent the last 15 years of my life ending coal, trying to end coal. We need to understand that this transition is not going to be easy. I keep talking about the mobility issue, but let me illustrate the point of why it's not going to be easy. It's going to be great. Electric vehicles, autonomous mobility, lower costs, more efficient transportation, etc., etc. But the internal combustion engine has 287 moving parts. The electric vehicle has about 28. When you eliminate supply chains for internal combustion engine vehicles, you're going to lose millions of jobs, not only in manufacturing, but the guy in the garage who changes your oil, the supply chain that does a fuel injection system, somebody who makes a component for different parts of the internal combustion engine. There's a huge potential social loss that comes in this transition, and unless we have ways of talking about that, and talking about the just transition in concrete ways, coming up with policies and metrics on how a just transition can be achieved, we're going to have very little traction. And we're going to have very little traction in the political equation where large capital vested in incumbent industries has such a dominant sway over government policy making. But things are beginning to change. If you saw recently with the Saudi Arabian attack, 6% of global oil production went offline in a minute. In normal times, when you're so dependent on fossil fuels, what would have happened in the global markets is weeks of uncertainty, fluctuation, price spikes, and the price would have gone out of the roof. Here we had 4 days of disruption, and we're just a couple of dollars above where we started, which illustrates that the point where and why I stress this, I'm not talking about the end of oil. What I'm talking about is the watershed where peak demand for fossil fuels will be reached, and more commentators think that'll be in the next 2 or 3 years. When peak demand is reached, it makes implications in terms of financial decisions and investment. Investors, pension funds, institutional investors, trillions of dollars in the system will look at peak demand and will start pricing risk in fossil fuels in a very different way. I know that we are concentrating a lot on public policy, and I think it's critical for the social reasons, but unless we understand the logic of how capital is allocated and how the choke points for the allocation of that capital can be utilized to go in a direction of decarbonization, we're not going to make much headway.
Any more questions? Yep, front.
Okay, I'm not an economist, Jens Ergon. I'm working within the Social Democratic Party of Sweden for a Green New Deal agenda. And you might think that, I mean, social democrats in Sweden, the Scandinavian welfare model and so on, that this might be natural, but I mean, it hasn't been. We are working on it right now, and we hope we can push it through. And you can see it in other countries. Labour in the UK, they adopted a Green New Deal agenda. You can see it in Spain and so on. So it's coming. But coming to my first point, I mean, it's important. I completely agree with the need for I mean, global Green New Deal and a revised Bretton Woods institutions, and that's very important. But isn't it like that to get there, you need victories at the domestic level, at national level? You need to push this through in some countries, some important countries. I mean, isn't that, it's not either or, but if you're going to have the space to get there, isn't that crucial? That's my first point. And the second point is more concrete. I mean, are there any alliances for a Green New Deal right now? Are there any networks built up? Because that's going to be needed. We're going to need to have that kind of thing. I mean, with parties, with institutions, with scientists, with think tanks who want to do this, because it's emerging at many places. But if we want to do this, we have to exchange ideas and coordinate. So that's what I basically. Is there interest for this? I'm interested. Thanks.
Well, very quickly, I will immediately join the movement myself, and I think that there is a need for a movement, and to look at success stories. There are some changes. The problem is that the political cycles and the economic cycles do not coincide with nature cycles. Usually, it's a time issue. And we have seen a certain path of a potentially successful story that in 24 months completely changed. So what was supposed to be a success story is not anymore. I'm not saying which country, because in this case I cannot, but there are other success stories of countries that have taken very, very seriously the contra-cyclical state-led public policy, control of the central banks, etc., etc. We have, some examples and some things to show, and I think that there is a need for a movement, and there is a need for a well-informed movement. Because when people think about the Green New Deal, they think about Bernie Sanders, which is fair enough. But I think this is goes beyond the United States, and it is happening in different places. I'm glad to hear that it is also happening in Sweden. But I think that there is a need for a global movement with a responsibility to do communication, to engage people, to have ambassadors that would, in their spaces, interactions, public opinion generators, politicians, that would just explain and spread the word, perhaps. So, I'm pro-movement, and I'll be there, standing and supporting anyhow. But thank you.
At the back, yeah, let's get you the mic.
Thanks, and thank you very much, everyone, for a really stimulating and engaging panel. I'd like to take this out of the real world and back to multilateralism for a moment. No, sorry, no more of that. There are bits of the multilateral system which very clearly provide powerful tools for dangerous incumbencies to continue to defend and advance their destructive practices. And one can think of the financial sector and financial services chapters and trade agreements. One can think of the EU-Mercosur agreement and agribusiness around the world. One can think of the fossil fuel industry and the Energy Charter Treaty, which provide them with very practical tools so that when assets are stranded, the costs of bearing that stranded asset is transferred from the private sector to the public sector. We pay for putting those assets to bed, which they must be, because their continued operation is incommensurate with stable life on Earth. So my question to the panel, the ones who can speak to this, what bits of the multilateral system would you like to see put to bed? What things have to be, are from another time and another place? And what are those things where you see interesting innovation that are useful to the kinds of transitions that we need to be forging? I was taken by your comments about, you're probably alluding to ARENA, is that it? Right, okay, well that would be an example, but where are those positive examples of the kind of multilateralism we need for the transition that we need to forge?
A great question.
Well, can you hear? Yeah. Well, first of all, I I completely agree that we have to speak to the power, but we have to find out what the real power is, the power that matters. If you talk to the powers that just want to maintain the status quo, that cannot change for political thing, like the multilateral bank, for instance, they'll have capacity. It's difficult. Linking that with your question, another question, putting parts aside. I see there's a lot of wonderful innovative is bringing others. It makes the system more cooperative and more inclusive. I'm going to take just one example. National Development Bank, which a lot about have had a significant role in financing, creating. You mentioned one that is at the moment badly treated, the national account. So there's several other cases where you see that it was the one big. I want to share one little add-on for doing. Look at the report on Indonesia, for example. The report on Indonesia is a very extreme case, and that is on a path of solutions that were low carbon growth and very successful case. One of the big is in greening the nation, in greening technology. China. I think people are missing what is happening. China has now the biggest green bonds market in the world. It has created incentives from the central bank for China's central bank. You remind me. It's financial institutions, the China Development Bank, China Import Bank, its green technology policy is an extraordinary path, and that was done as a political pressure from within for sustainability. We talk about that. This is changing everything. It's a huge thing for us. I want to mention another case that is long and enduring. Germany. Germany has changed always. It's changed completely. Big industrial policy instruments towards low carbon growth. And I can go on talking about other examples that are here, but there are several examples. I think we have to include those instruments and those people, the national development, the new multilateral institutions, the BRICS Bank and the AIIB, extraordinary potential. They have to be on board. Not putting other, just bringing more. Say.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. So shall we wrap this? Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you for all panelists.